8 small footprints in the snow led to the man who had once buried hope beneath his own hands. At the edge of nowhere, where the wind howled like it carried the voices of the dead, a man named Caleb Morrison stood at the edge of his field with a shovel in one hand and a revolver in the other. He wasn't digging for crops. He was digging a hole meant for himself, not out of cowardice, but because he truly believed the world had nothing left to offer. His wife was gone. His little girl swallowed by fever 2 winters back. The land didn't speak to him anymore. The silence wasn't peace, it was punishment. But just as the last layer of frozen dirt gave way, he heard it. A sound no grieving man expects to hear when he's ready to die. A child's cry. He turned, and through the curtain of snowfall came 5 silhouettes, shivering, ragged, barely alive orphans no older than 10 or 12, stumbling toward the dim light flickering from his cabin window. No horses, no shoes, no plan. Just desperation wrapped in frost-bitten skin and wide, frightened eyes. And that was the moment everything changed. This story isn't about a hero. It's about a man who had nothing left and gave it anyway. It's about 5 children who ran from a nightmare and found a broken man who remembered how to fight. Stay with me, because what happens next will test everything you believe about courage, justice, and what it means to be a father when the law stands against you. This is the story of Caleb Morrison, the man who defied the system and found a family worth dying for. Caleb Morrison hadn't spoken a word to another soul in over 3 years. Not since the fever took Annie and Lily, wife and daughter, gone in the same cruel week. The doctor came too late. The prayers came too slow. And the dirt came too fast. He remembered the sound it made when he shoveled it over 2 pine boxes side by side. Hollow, final, like the land itself was swallowing the last reasons he had to live. After that, he stopped tending the ranch. Let the fences rot. Let the cows wander off into the hills. Let the well dry. The only thing Caleb kept sharp was his shovel and the pain. He didn't drink. That would have been too easy. He didn't ride to town, too many faces that looked away. No one dared ask how he was, and that was fine by him. He just walked the edges of his dying land every morning, boots crunching over gravel and dried up roots, listening for anything that might remind him he was still human. But silence was all he heard. On that final day, or what he thought would be his final day, Caleb took the old wooden cross he'd carved the night before and walked it to the far end of the field. The sun had barely risen. The air smelled of dry cedar and coming rain. He planted the cross etched with 7 plain words, "Here lies a man who gave up." No name, no date, just truth. Then he started digging. Hour after hour, red dust clung to his sweat. The Texas heat pressed down like punishment. And with every shovelful of dirt, he felt lighter, not free, just empty. His arms burned, but his heart was quiet for the first time in years. No memories, no screams, no what-ifs. Just him, the earth, and the silence, till it wasn't silent anymore. At first he thought it was a trick of the heat, a shape in the corner of his eye. But then there were voices, small, fragile, and trembling. He looked up. 5 little shadows stood at the edge of his grave. The oldest, barely a teenager. The youngest, no more than 6. Dirt on their faces, blood on their clothes, and fear, real raw fear, that didn't belong on faces so young. "Mister," the tall girl said, her voice tight as a drawn wire. "We need your help." Caleb stared at them, unable to move the shovel, frozen midair, because something deep inside him cracked, not like glass, but like ice thawing, slow, painful, unavoidable. And before he could stop himself, he asked the one question that would change everything. "Where did you come from?" The girl's answer wasn't long, but it was enough to wake the man Caleb had buried long ago. They stood there, 5 little ghosts against the bright white of the morning. No sound but the hush of wind sweeping over the frost-bitten earth. The grave Caleb had dug gaped behind him, a mouth waiting to close. But it would not close today, because death, for the first time in a long time, was asked to wait. The oldest girl's name was Emma. She spoke with the calm of someone who'd seen too much, the quiet edge of a child, forced to become a mother. Her dress was torn at the hem, her arms scratched, her face smeared with dust. Yet her eyes carried something no shovel could bury: defiance. "They'll kill us if we go back," she said, voice barely above a whisper, but strong enough to shake Caleb's spine. The youngest clung to a threadbare doll, its head dangling by a stitch. The middle girls stood in a tight cluster, watching him the way animals watch a man with a gun, hoping for mercy, bracing for pain. Caleb didn't speak. Not yet. His body was still kneeling in the grave, but his soul had already climbed out. There was something unholy in what these girls had fled from, and something deeply human in the way they still stood tall, even when their legs trembled. He took a step back, letting the shovel fall to the dust with a dull clank. "No one's supposed to be out here," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "Not for miles." "We walked," Emma said. 2 days. Through the night. Her voice broke just slightly at night. Caleb understood why. The desert was a different kind of killer in the dark. Coyotes, cold, the kind of silence that tricks you into thinking you're already dead. "And why here?" he asked, unable to stop the words. Emma hesitated. "Then, because they said you used to be kind." That stopped him. Not because it was wrong, but because it used to be true. He stared at her, this stranger who somehow knew the man he used to be. And for a terrible second, Caleb wanted to scream at her, to tell her he wasn't that man anymore, that he was tired, finished, a ghost with a heartbeat. But instead, he asked the second question that sealed his fate. "Who's chasing you?" Her mouth barely moved. "Men from the orphanage." That word orphanage, it rang with something cold and foul. Caleb had heard rumors, places where unwanted children disappeared, where coin changed hands and questions were never asked. The wind picked up again, tossing dust into the morning air. But now it wasn't just dust. It was the sound of hooves. Far off, faint, but closing. Emma turned. Her face went pale. "They found us." Caleb looked at her, then at the girls, then at the grave he'd dug for himself. He wasn't ready for a fight. He wasn't ready to feel again. But it wasn't about being ready anymore. It was about being needed. There are places where laughter should echo, where the scrape of little shoes on wooden floors and the murmur of lullabies should fill the air. But at the Riverside Orphanage, silence was the loudest sound. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of fear, of survival, of secrets so deep they hollowed out the souls of children before they ever had a chance to grow. Emma was only 10 when she first arrived, clutching her baby sister, and the belief that someone, anyone, might care enough to help. The orphanage promised warm beds, steady meals, even books. But behind the smiles and legal documents lay a different truth, one stitched together by pain and sealed with coin. Caleb listened as Emma spoke, her voice barely a whisper, beneath the whine of wind outside his cabin walls. She didn't cry. Not once. Children from that place had long since run out of tears. "There were doors you weren't allowed to open," she said. "Rooms where no one came back the same. We never knew who'd disappear next." He clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening around a chipped coffee mug he no longer tasted. The girls sat close by the fire, eyes darting at every creak, every sound. They flinched when he stood. They flinched when he reached for his coat. What had those men done to them, to make even kindness feel like a threat? "Why didn't anyone stop it?" Caleb asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Emma looked up, her eyes older than any child's should be. "Because no one believed us. Because Mr. Thornton had papers, judges, a sheriff who said we were lucky to have a roof at all. He said we were nothing." The word nothing hit like a slap. Caleb stared into the flames, heart pounding in a chest that had once gone numb. These girls weren't just running from cruelty. They were running from a system built to erase them, and the men who profited from that erasure. How many more, he asked, the question sticking in his throat. Emma didn't blink. Dozens, maybe more. And just like that, Caleb's world shifted. He'd thought his grief was a private war, a wound that belonged only to him. But grief had 1,000 faces, and 5 of them were now sitting in his home, wrapped in borrowed blankets and bruises no child should bear. Outside, the wind howled again. But inside, something had changed. He stood, walked to the door, and locked it. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, "but I know what I won't do. I won't let them take you, because in the end, monsters don't just steal childhoods. They count on no one fighting back." But Caleb Morrison had just joined the war. It came just before dawn, a knock sharp and cold that rattled the old door like a threat. Caleb was already awake, staring at the dying fire, his rifle across his lap. He hadn't slept all night. Not really. Not with 5 girls curled on the floor beside him, their small bodies twitching in restless dreams, chased by memories that should have never been theirs to carry. The knock came again. Not desperate, not polite. The kind of knock that said, "We're not asking." Emma stirred, her eyes snapping open with fear so instinctive it made Caleb's blood run cold. She didn't ask who it was. She already knew. "Stay down," he whispered, rising slowly. He crossed the floor with quiet purpose, heart thudding like hooves on dry earth. From the small window he saw them. 3 riders, black coats, wide-brimmed hats, men who looked like they'd long forgotten the taste of mercy. One of them, the tallest, sat his horse like a man who owned everything his eyes touched. And Caleb knew in that moment he wasn't a sheriff. He was something far worse. "Open up," the man called out. "We're looking for some girls. Property of the Riverside home." Property. The word tore something inside Caleb. These weren't horses, weren't crates of grain. They were children, flesh and blood. And yet this man, this enforcer, spoke like he was retrieving misplaced furniture. "I don't see any girls here," Caleb answered through the door. "And this land's private." "Got legal documents," the man said. "Signed, stamped. Says them girls belong to us until they're of age. You're harboring runaways. That makes you a criminal." Behind him, little Daisy coughed, her breath ragged from the cold and the fear. Another girl whimpered, and Caleb turned, saw them all huddled together like hunted animals. The law was never meant to protect men like Silas Thornton. But out here in the dust and distance, justice was whatever money could buy. And Thornton had deep pockets. "You got 30 seconds, the man warned, "before we come in and take what's ours." Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle. He didn't know how many more of them waited in the trees. Didn't know if this was a bluff or the beginning of a siege. But he knew one thing: he would not give these girls back. Not to that place. Not to them. Because there comes a moment when a man has to choose not between safety and danger, but between being a bystander or becoming the wall that evil can't pass. He backed away from the door, turned to the children. "Into the cellar," he said, voice steady. Quiet as ghosts. And as they slipped into the shadows, Caleb whispered something he hadn't said in years. A prayer not for himself, but for strength to do what needed doing. Because the knock on the door wasn't from the law. It was from the devil dressed in legal paper and a sheriff's badge. The cabin had always been quiet. A place where grief could whisper and go unanswered. Where each creaking floorboard and flickering lamp filled the silence Margaret used to chase away with her laughter. Caleb had built it for peace, but now that peace had to be broken. As the girls huddled in the root cellar below, low, wrapped in old quilts in fear, Caleb crouched near the hearth rifle, in one hand, heart pounding louder than the wind outside. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. It felt strange having heat, light, and breath in a room that had held only ghosts for years. Then came the third knock. No pretense this time, just violence tapping on his front door. A voice followed, cold, methodical. "We're coming in. Last warning." Caleb didn't answer. He just slid the latch on the door, not to open it, but to prepare. Then he walked over to the window and blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the cabin. All that remained was the orange glow of the fire and the resolve tightening in his chest like a rusted hinge creaking back into place. They tried to break the door in with a boot, but he'd reinforced it with iron 2 winters ago, when coyotes had been bold and grief had made him paranoid. The second kick rattled the hinges. Caleb steadied his breathing. Not rage, not fear, just something fierce and still, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks the heat. The third strike split the door. The first man through didn't expect resistance. He barely got 2 steps into the room before Caleb's rifle barked once, sending him crashing into the table Margaret had once set with Sunday bread. The second man was faster, ducked low, firing blindly. A bullet shattered the mantel. Sparks flew. The fire roared higher. Caleb dropped behind the armchair, breathing smoke and memory. His hands moved on instinct, reloading from a pouch of cartridges he hadn't touched in years. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. But it wasn't just about bullets. It was about what kind of man he was willing to become for those 5 children. Outside, the wind shrieked like a warning. The third man called out, "You're outnumbered, old man. Don't die over someone else's mistake." But the thing was, Caleb didn't see them as someone else's mistake. He saw them as what was left of a world worth protecting. He fired again. This time the shot hit the door frame, forcing the last man to duck back outside. Smoke filled the room, but the fear that had lived there for years was gone. In its place stood something steadier, something warm. Not hope, not yet, but defiance. And sometimes defiance is the first spark of something stronger. The blizzard had teeth now, real ones. It bit at Caleb's neck as he helped the children down the back slope of the ridge, snow swallowing their tracks as quickly as they made them. The cabin, his grief-shaped sanctuary, was behind them, now glowing faintly through the storm, smoke still curling from the chimney like a final breath. Little Josie clung to his coat, shivering so hard he felt it through the layers. Her mittens were soaked, and the hem of her dress had turned to ice. He lifted her onto his back without a word, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck. Behind him, Ruthie led the others with the kind of quiet authority no 12-year-old should have to carry. They didn't ask where they were going. They just followed him into the white, believing somehow that this quiet man who spoke more with gestures than words knew the way. Caleb wasn't sure he did, but he knew this staying meant death. He'd memorized the trail to an abandoned trapper's cabin about 3 miles east, a place no map marked anymore. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof barely holding. But if they made it, it would be enough to shelter the children from what came next. Each step felt heavier than the last. Snow to his knees. Wind like knives. His arms ached from carrying Josie, but every time he thought of setting her down, he saw the fever burning on her face, and he couldn't not, after what he'd seen back in that orphanage file Ruthie had shown him. Not after knowing what Silas Thornton had planned for her. Papa Caleb, Josie whispered, half-conscious. He hadn't expected the word. It stopped him cold. It wasn't a title he'd earned. But in that moment, it became a promise. He pressed forward. The others were stumbling now. Tommy fell once, then again. Caleb dropped to his knees beside him, checking his breath. Still there, but shallow. The boy's lips were pale, almost blue. They were running out of time. Then, just as the last shred of his strength began to fray, the silhouette of the trapper's cabin loomed through the snow, sagging, crooked, but standing. Caleb didn't cry. Not when he buried his wife, not when the cabin went quiet for 2 years. But something in him cracked when he lit the fire and saw Ruthie spread blankets over Josie, while the boys huddled close, teeth-chattering eyes slowly blinking open with warmth. He didn't say it aloud, but they all felt it. They'd survived. And maybe survival was the first form of hope. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside, in that tiny broken cabin, something had begun to mend quietly, slowly, like a flame inside wet kindling. Tomorrow there would be more danger, more decisions, more lines to cross. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Caleb wasn't running from ghosts. He was protecting a future. Morning broke slow and silver. No sun, just a pale light struggling through clouds thick with more snow. Inside the trapper's cabin, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your ribs and reminds you the world is holding its breath. Caleb sat by the window, rifle across his knees, eyes on the tree line. He hadn't slept. Not really. Just closed his eyes now and then, listening for hoofbeats that hadn't come. Yet. Behind him, the children were stirring. Ruthie was up first, always the first, coaxing the fire back to life, wrapping Josie tighter in the blanket, checking Tommy's fever. She moved like someone used to responsibility, someone who'd stopped waiting for rescue and started becoming one. "They'll come," Ruthie said softly without turning. "They will." Caleb nodded. I know. The orphanage hadn't given up its property. Men like Silas Thornton didn't like to lose, especially not to men like Caleb. And now they'd taken someone that couldn't be bought back. They'd broken the rules of their own twisted game. And Caleb had broken something in return. The children weren't talking much, but he could see it in their eyes. They were tired of running, of hiding, of wondering who would disappear next. That was when Ruthie said something Caleb hadn't expected. We could fight. He turned to her slowly, studying her face. She didn't flinch. We know these woods better than they do, she added. There's an old ridge path behind the cabin, leads to a ravine. We used to trap rabbits near it. We could set up something. You're talking about an ambush, Caleb said. She nodded. Do you even know what that means? I know what losing means, she said, eyes fierce. I know what it means when nobody fights back. I know what they did to Clara. And I know we're not the same kids they locked in that place anymore. Caleb looked around the room. Tommy still coughing but sitting up. Beth quiet but no longer crying. Josie pale but watching with eyes wide open. He'd brought them into this storm. Now they were showing him a way through it. You'll need to be brave, he said quietly. Braver than you've ever been. Ruthie gave a half smile. We've been brave our whole lives, mister. We're just finally done being scared. Outside, the wind had shifted. The sound of hooves. Distant, but coming closer. Caleb stood and checked his rifle again. The time for hiding was over. If they wanted these children, they'd have to walk through fire to get them. And this time, the fire would fight back. The first shot cracked the silence like lightning splitting a tree. It wasn't Caleb's. It was Silas Thornton's men, first 2, then 5, riding up the ridge, rifles out, eyes hard and soulless. They weren't wearing badges, but they didn't need them. The law didn't ride with them. It worked for them, same as always. Caleb took cover behind the woodpile, steady hands loading his Winchester, with the calm of a man who had already made peace with what must be done. Inside the cabin, the children crouched behind furniture and walls. Ruthie kept them quiet eyes on the door. They had one chance, one ambush, and it had to count. The plan was simple. Delay, distract, divide. Then strike. When the second rider crept toward the cabin, Caleb waited until he stepped into the open. Then he rose. One warning. This is your last chance. Turn around. Nobody needs to die today. The man laughed, cruel and cold, spitting into the snow. You've got children, Mercer, not soldiers. And you're just one man. That's more than enough, Caleb said and fired. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, sent him sprawling back into the snow. The rest erupted. Gunfire flashed from behind trees. Ruthie's trap, an old logging chain tied between 2 trunks, sent another rider flying from his saddle. Chaos. Children screamed. Horses reared. Caleb moved like memory fast, focused without thought. This wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. Years of grief and guilt had hardened him into something unbreakable. They'd taken too much already. He would give no more. Silas Thornton emerged last. Polished boots, black gloves, a revolver so clean it gleamed in the gray light. You've made a mess, Mercer, he said, voice like oil on water. These children were our responsibility, ours to place, ours to profit from. They're not livestock, Caleb said, stepping forward. Boots crunching through blood and snow. They're not yours. You're a criminal now. You'll die that way. Caleb looked him in the eye. Maybe. But I'll die standing. He fired. The shot echoed off the hills, final and unforgiving. Silas Thornton fell mouth open in disbelief, coat blooming red. And in that moment, the storm began to break. The last of Thornton's men fled, leaving behind their guns, their papers, their power. Whatever grip they held on this land had been buried under snow and justice. Caleb turned back toward the cabin. Children ran to him, muddy, bruised, still breathing. Ruthie stood in the doorway, hands trembling but eyes clear. You okay? She asked. He nodded, wiping blood from his brow. For the first time in years. But even as peace settled around them like snowfall, Caleb knew there were more like Thornton out there. And more children with nowhere to run. He hadn't ended a war. He'd only joined it. The morning after the gunfire, the house stood silent once more. But it wasn't the silence of grief. It was the stillness of something waiting to be reborn. The front door still hung crooked on broken hinges. Bullet holes pockmarked the cabin's wooden frame. The porch was stained with old blood and fresher mud. Yet in the middle of it all, Ruthie was laughing. Not softly, but with her head tilted back and her hands covered in flour, as she taught little Sarah how to knead dough without letting it stick to her elbows. Caleb stood by the window watching them, one hand wrapped around a steaming mug of chicory coffee. He wasn't smiling, not exactly, but there was a softness around his eyes that hadn't been there in years. A stillness in his chest that felt dangerously close to peace. Outside, the others worked with clumsy, determined purpose. Tommy had taken it upon himself to fix the chicken coop, even if he had no idea how to hammer straight. Marcus was teaching the twins how to stack firewood without crushing their toes. Beth sat on the porch with a kitten Ruthie had found in the barn, nursing it back to life with a rag and warm milk. They weren't rebuilding a house. They were reclaiming a home, and in doing so, they were stitching Caleb back together without even knowing it. He remembered the silence after Margaret and the boys died, how the air inside these walls had grown too heavy to breathe, how he'd kept the rooms exactly the same, like preserving ghosts in amber. Every chair untouched, every coat still on the peg. But now the table was too small. There were muddy boots piled at the door, giggles echoing down the hallway, handprints on the walls, and half-finished drawings of wild horses taped beside the window. Ghosts didn't live here anymore. He thought of Margaret standing on that same porch years ago, with her apron blowing in the wind, her laughter chasing the boys around the yard. She would have loved this. Not just the children, but the noise, the mess, the second chance. That evening, as the sky turned to gold and the fire crackled in the hearth, Caleb sat with the children around the dinner table, the one he'd built with his own hands back when hope still lived in this house. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we patch the roof. And fix the barn door, Ruthie added, smiling at him. And build a treehouse, shouted Marcus, raising his fork like a sword. The others laughed. The cabin groaned softly in the wind, not from age, but from life returning. And as Caleb looked around at the tired, hungry, smiling faces, he knew the worst had passed, not because they'd fought their enemies, but because they'd found each other. It wasn't just his house anymore. It was theirs. The snow had melted by spring, but some things would never wash away. The blood on the floorboards, the echoes of gunfire in the walls, the memory of one man standing between innocence and a world that tried to crush it. But out in the fields, something else had taken root. Caleb Morrison was no longer just a hermit or a broken widower. He was a father again, though not by blood, but by choice. And in a land where choices shape destinies more than bloodlines ever did, that meant everything. The farm didn't look like much to an outsider. The barn still leaned a little. The roof still leaked when the wind blew from the east. But inside the house, laughter danced across every surface. The kind of laughter that had once died with a fever and now returned on the wings of second chances. Caleb had taught them how to mend fences, drive cattle chutes straight, but more than that, they'd taught him how to feel again. Tommy called him Pa now, without hesitation. Ruthie ran the household like a girl twice her age. Even little Sarah had started humming Margaret's lullaby in her sleep, though she'd never heard it before. Word had gotten around, as it always does in the West, about the orphanage, about the men who came and didn't leave, about the farmer who stood his ground, not with speeches, but with silent steel and the weight of a heart that had already lost everything once. No marshal came to arrest him. No judge sent a summons, because the people who made the rules knew better than to test a man who had nothing left to fear. Instead, ranchers began to send quiet offerings, blankets, horseshoes, even books. One man rode from 2 counties over just to shake Caleb's hand, say thank you, and leave a satchel of seed corn at his feet. He didn't do it for thanks. He didn't even do it for the children, not at first. He did it because there's a line every man has to draw, and when evil steps over it wearing the mask of the law, someone's got to remind the world what right looks like, even if it costs them everything. And in doing so, Caleb reminded an entire town, maybe an entire West, that peace isn't something you inherit. It's something you fight for. And sometimes the ones who've lost the most become the guardians of what matters most. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the kids raced back from the creek with wet boots and muddy smiles, Caleb stood on the porch and whispered to the wind, "Margaret, we're home." And for the first time in a long time, it felt true. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you believe again in sacrifice and second chances, in the quiet strength of ordinary men, hit that subscribe button. Because on this channel, every story reminds us that the West wasn't won by guns or gold, but by hearts that refused to give up. And if you're ready for another tale just as powerful, just as unforgettable, click on the next video. A storm's brewing, and the next hero is already saddling up.